actually almost backed out of this session, and then I backed back in, partly because I started writing fiction, near future sci-fi, based off ideas that I had when I moved here to Helsinki and then learned about MyData. I felt, for me, it was a lot about moving to a new country and everything feeling really new. And for some reason, that felt like it opened space in my mind to imagine new things. And once I started learning about MyData and thinking about the possible futures of technologies, that's when all of a sudden kind of like characters and worlds started to form in my head. So I started this program for myself of writing fiction. I read Stephen King's book about writing, which is a kind of famous one where he basically recommends you should write by starting to write. And so I set a goal of writing 1,500 words every day in the morning. And I didn't really have a structure as to where my story should go. So that ended with me writing a lot of stuff, and in the end me feeling like it wasn't that good. And so when the time came for the conference, I was like, I really don't have anything to share, but I decided I would share some stuff and a bit about my process, even though I don't have my finished stories here. So the basic concept, something that came to me through the process of writing fiction that I actually think is really relevant, is this concept of metaphor and really thinking about what metaphor means. And I came across this quote in Friedrich Kittler's book, Gramophone Typewriter Film. He's a media theorist that's talking about metaphor, and it's talking about scientific discovery. And it says, discoveries frequently start with metaphors. The light of thinking could hardly fall in a new direction and illuminate the dark corners were it not reflected by spaces already illuminated. Here, in the as yet imperfect state of science, I'm skipping a bit, metaphors are absolutely necessary. Before we know, we have to start by imagining something. And so, something that got me thinking about, it was like, how do you envision things that don't already exist? And that's by tying it to things that do already exist, even if they seem somewhat unrelated. And part of what I think was valuable in this process was realizing that a lot of the drive or the draw to technology for people is this open space for creativity and for discovering something new, and trying to think about how can we harness this idea of creativity and tap into the idea of possibilities in a way that still accounts for some unexpected consequences. And so for me, I started writing this story. There were many different drafts, but the tentative title is Safe is Where I'll Keep You. If you want, you can take it, because I might never finish my story. But it's set in near future Helsinki, and I'm just going to walk you through like some of the premises that I was working off of. It's set in Helsinki in the near future. At this point, there is a closed FinNet that's closed from the rest of the internet. There's a closed identity system that's on the blockchain, but it's a closed blockchain, and it's called One and Only One, OOO. Basically, you and only you can be yourself. Everybody, they have this angel AI that is activated by temporary body tattoos that they get from the government. So it's a temporary tattoo. So right now they're doing a lot with temporary tattoos to like monitor biometrics and stuff like that, and that's how the sensors are activated, and it keeps it a fairly non-invasive and flexible system, and your attention is currency. And so I have these characters. There's Jarno. He's someone who, in our present day reality, would be someone who's a bit paranoid about security. He's a security specialist. He liked to keep himself totally off the grid. And he actually helped develop this one and only one system, like how you do the distributed identity ledger, but he himself will not use the Angel AI. He keeps like this little carton of smart cards where he stores everything. There's his daughter Pipsa. She's in high school and trying to navigate the complexities of being a young woman in her teenage years. There's Jamil, who Pipsa befriends, and there's Risto, who lives in this kind of collective commune with Jamil's older sister. And that's kind of all of the pieces that I'll give you. And so basically where I was coming in was creating plots that combine all of these. And based off these ingredients, I am sure some of you could imagine some different ways that it would go. The way that I was envisioning it was in order to have a system where the AI was as integrated as we could see it being, in the end they decided they had to close it off. And so some of the people who were then rebelling against the system, it's like, I was also trying to toy with this idea of people being outside of current structures, and then what happens when they become the establishment. So Jarno is the one who kind of like symbolizes that, and then who becomes the new people who exist outside the system and who are critical of it. And those are the ones like Risto and Jamil's older sister. And basically they are trying to live off the grid, but they're making money by counterfeiting these body tattoos. Because at this point, in order to have a closed system, Finland's totally closed off its borders. And so what happens when you don't have this level of freedom of movement, and how do you keep it secure? And so I think I only have 15 minutes. I would be curious to open it up to discussion. I have some pieces that I could read, but I don't know. Does anybody have any questions before I do that? Yes. Sorry, Ian. Yeah.
Okay. So, FinNet. Can you tell me a bit more about, the kind of how that would work, or how that would be different from the other, the one that's not connected to? I'm just kind of wondering about the differences.
Right. How I was envisioning it, there would be certain countries that would kind of close off their internet exchange points, which actually Finland doesn't have like that many internet exchange points. So when you talk about like connecting to the wider internet, that's actually a possibility. And I would think there is also like a broader internet that wasn't as regulated. And this was me kind of trying to also think through what, from my like somewhat outsider perspective, was like also some underlying tensions within the MyData movement that I saw. One being a bit more of like a libertarian version of like maybe we won't need so much governance, and another that's saying like actually we do need these governmental structures to protect us. And so I was trying to envision like what would happen if you saw like some of the Scandinavian countries continuing in a direction of feeling like they did trust the government and they wanted these systems, but everything else had gotten like really out of control. What would be one extreme of that, but trying not to see it as purely dystopian, because those books have been written, I would say. Yeah, Nina.
I really like this. Do you have some metaphors that you're already kind of toying with? What would be a useful metaphor for you to arrange this world? I have other questions also, if I can say them, but I'll start with that. And then funny little detail. Risto is misspelled. Now it's exploitation.
Is it one? That means exploitation.
Yes.
I actually recently changed to...
She knew.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because that's the way that this started off was Risto commits a crime against Jarno, and that was like the starting point for how things unfold. I wanted it to be kind of an identity theft, but then I wasn't sure if that was like a bit too obvious and too impractical, like would he actually be able to steal his identity? Yes, so a metaphor. I have been thinking a lot about water metaphors for data, and this idea of data kind of seamlessly flowing, and how many metaphors we already use to describe data transfer with water. So this idea of having like torrents and streams and things like that, and how that constructs how we think about data flowing, which kind of obscures like a lot of the like technical physical layers and the labor that goes into making data get from one location to another. And so through this story, I was kind of trying to question that idea of data just seamlessly flowing, and calling up that like actually we do have a lot of control over how things happen, and what would happen if like some of this control was exerted in certain ways. Yeah.
Just going on what you just said, why is identity theft impractical? Just because I think it's in the near future will become very urgent, and it is already. Fraud is like the number one concern, especially with governments. And there are lots of stories about identity theft. And I think there are also insurance companies now going to provide you insurance against identity theft. So I think it actually is a really good and likely story.
Yeah, that's something that I had, so writing fiction doesn't come like so naturally to me. I would say I feel more comfortable with nonfiction, and I felt myself constantly questioning. Like I was like, would Jarno actually be that vulnerable? Like if he was this really good security guy, would it be that easy to just like steal his identity? And then I found myself getting really caught up in like the technicalities of like, okay, how would that actually happen? But yeah, I think it could, I was thinking maybe like the society had become so safe and so trusting that actually crimes rarely happened, and that like opened it up to vulnerability. But again, I don't know if that was practical or not. But yeah. Yeah, Kai.
yesterday we had in our conference we had a session about the business architecture, and there was a big surprise to me that there are people who have been involved in ICANN, and they are saying that the ICANN might be going sort of not perhaps destroyed, but sort of fade away or be divided into different subsections. And if the thought for me at least that we would be totally disconnecting from internet sounds a little bit far, but not unrealistic. But this idea that actually like new DNS is coming through and what that already could mean for the internet and how we use it and access it, it felt actually quite real, and that made me think about different governances and trust networks quite much. So I think that it's a really interesting topic, and definitely something that we might end up discussing quite early or quite in the near future already.
Definitely. That's actually, I have to say that part of where that came from was back in 2014, 2015. There was the big vote that was happening. I think it was at like the ITU conference, whatever's the international union kind of governing spectrum. There was this big vote happening, and there was this big push on the part of the Chinese and Russian government to make things not governed by a multi-stakeholder model for the DNS assignments. And the language that they were using was this language of sovereignty. China was coming out and saying, like, we want internet sovereignty, like we want to be able to govern our own internet, which I think is like kind of an old question, but still super pressing. Like, how do you have local laws apply to these international, like, pseudo-governmental systems?
But isn't that in a sense actually, if you talk, I don't speak Chinese, but what I hear is that actually the Chinese internet is very, very different, and they have completely different sets of apps and completely different access, different information, different interfaces. So isn't that in a sense actually kind of already happening to what you described here?
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's calling in like what is like the cultural internet versus like the governance of the internet, right? Because there still are local internet experiences, even though we think of it as this global thing. But I think they were talking a bit more about like, I'm forgetting all the words now because there were some technical things, but they basically wanted the voting systems for the internet to work more like only having official government representatives, more similar to the UN, as opposed to the current multi-stakeholder model that happens like at the Internet Governance Forum and stuff like that, where currently decisions are made about like spectrum and lots of stuff. But this is also a few years ago, so I'm forgetting totally the terminology, but yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious about how you came to this conclusion that in order to work, if I got you right, that in order to work, especially the AI, needed a closed system. Was it just for security reasons, or was there I sort of understood that there was something else.
It was mostly security reasons, but also about like having things verified around a single identity. And there was a lot that I was playing with about like how children use the web and what are the strict constrictions with that. Because the way I was envisioning it was like if you were underage, you would get this one daily digest that was like filtered through these different mechanisms where like at 6 p.m. at night, you would get like all of your interactions, all of your messages, kind of like after school time and after homework time and stuff like that. And I was just imagining that like to have all these certain provisions to like keep life a certain way, you would need to have things comply to local laws. And I kept coming to like, how can you have things comply to local laws if you don't have the local internet? Yeah, but that was mostly my thinking.
Can I add two mini questions to that? Why is it national to you?
Because those are the lines that already exist. I feel like there was such a moment of cyber utopianism where people thought like nation state lines were going to go away, but they really haven't. And for me, like, I kept coming back against that. Like, I moved to Finland and then I was going to school in Sweden, and like the practicalities are when you move, so much is determined by like the country that you're moving to and their systems that they have in place. And all these many ways that you don't think about before you make the move. And I think all of these systems are what people are going to have to contend with if they actually want to make these like services on a society-wide level. Like, you just have to deal with that. Yeah. yeah, like doctor stuff, travels, like opening up bank accounts, getting verified, like ID cards, all of this. So, yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.